Well, thank you very much, Jonathan. That was a very nice introduction. I'd just like to say it's really very nice to see you all here today, old friends, old students, colleagues, friends from Bristol and further afield. I feel very privileged that you've all come to listen to me talk tonight. And what I'm wanting to talk about is what should we teach our children in school about history? And it's something which we can find in the press a lot of the time. There's lots of debates going on in the press. It's puzzling for teachers, it's puzzling for parents as well. And actually it's globally as well, because this latest book, History Wars and the Classroom, Global Perspectives, reminds us that throughout the world, nations are thinking about what sorts of stories about the past should we tell our children. And what I'm going to do tonight is give you a personal take on this, about some of the challenges which you meet when you're developing a history curriculum, and some of the opportunities as well. So it's a very personal journey through what might be appropriate to learn for history. But I'm not going to do all the work, because you've come here and you think you're going to listen to me, but I'm just going to check audience participation. And so I'm going to ask you to think for 30 seconds what you would suggest would be appropriate to learn for young children in school. So you have just 30 minutes, and then I shall just take some comments from the audience. This could be a significant event or a period, I don't mind. Just think what it might be. And of course you wait till you see eyes go up. Has anybody got something they'd like to think would be good? Thank you, Jane.
Explorers.
Explorers, thank you. Yes. Anybody else?
The local history.
The local history, yeah.
Lives of ordinary people.
Lives of ordinary people, yeah.
Africa and Asian history.
All right. Africa, Asian history, yes. Family history. We could go on, but you can see that there are lots and lots of different views, aren't there, about what is important in history. So it's a contested field. People have their own personal views on it. When I ask students, I sometimes ask them for dates, because history is always associated with dates. And a lot of them will say 1066. And then you say, what happened in 1066? And they don't know. Another favourite date they come up with is 1966. I wonder why. Britain won the World Cup, yeah. They also think their birthday is quite important as well. I just want to remind you then that there's lots of different views on what history is to teach. And I've got here a suggested alphabet of history, which was produced in 1923. The Board of Education was very worried that children were leaving school without a knowledge of the history of their nation. If this sounds familiar, yeah. And so they put together this alphabet of dates. They made it clear that it's a suggested alphabet, it's not compulsory. But if you look at it, you can see there's quite a lot of constitutional history, administrative history, key events, Trafalgar, Waterloo, and some social and cultural history as well. So that was their idea, and that's nearly 100 years ago. And of course, they said, though, that they didn't really, they weren't suggesting that you had to teach that, because, again, I put this up because this has a curious ring about what's happening now, is the Board of Education in 1905 said, well, actually, we don't want all children to learn the same sort of thing. We want teachers to think for themselves and to make some judgments about what might be appropriate. And this is, over 100 years ago, and it's quite interesting seeing where we've got to now in terms of the national curriculum. So, looking at these documents, both the alphabet of dates and the Elementary Education Handbook recommendation serve as a reminder that education and its policies need to be contextualised within the times in which they were produced, and also that curricula are cultural artefacts they are, as Basil Bernstein would remind us, powerful symbols of what is regarded as worthwhile knowledge and what's valued by those in authority at the time. Drawing on Bernstein's work, Ivor Goodson, in his research on the development of curriculum subjects, argues that subjects should not be viewed as monolithic entities, and rather he sees them as amalgamations of different traditions and pressure groups, which through contestation and compromise influence the direction of change. And it's actually these different traditions which influence the curriculum, which I want to talk to you in this lecture tonight. Curriculum's not static. It changes according to, it could be policy, politics, but also views about how we see history and how we learn history, the historiography which goes with it. And then, of course, the particular views that we have on appropriate pedagogy as well. In what ways can children learn history effectively? And these have all been influences on the curriculum. Now, if we look at the first history national curriculum, there's a lot been written on this. The first national curriculum for history came from the 1988 Education Reform Act and was enacted in 1991. And there's been some very detailed research through a researcher going through all the minutes of the history working group, looking at the debates which were going on at that time in the creation of the first history curriculum. And we can put this down to roughly about 3 different views. The great tradition, that the transmission of key British history facts so that children would all have a strong cultural heritage, would all know about Trafalgar, would all know about Waterloo, Magna Carta. And that Stuart Duker, who was at one time chair of the Campaign for Real Education, put it so clearly. That was when a school was a school and a teacher was a teacher and a history was more or less history. So you really knew what you were getting, good textbooks to follow. And of course that wasn't what was happening in a lot of schools at the time, because the new approaches to history had been developed throughout the 1980s, and there was this particular Schools Council history project which looked more about children investigating the past. So instead of being actually reading and copying out from textbooks, they were encouraged to do their own investigations, to raise questions, look at different sources of evidence. And it wasn't just the history of the great and the good, it was family histories, local histories, social, etc. So there were those 2 pressure groups on the history curriculum. And from my point of view as well, there was another pressure, which was actually, how is this history as a subject going to sit in what were my beliefs about teaching primary children. And I go back to the Plowden report, which says that at the heart of the educational process lies the child. How does the child make sense of learning experiences? How can we create learning experiences for children to develop, not just in one subject, but holistically as well? So their social, their cultural, their cognitive development are developed. And that has an uneasy tension with thinking about a subject in the school. We have to think about how we can develop that with the children. And so as a result of the History National Curriculum, there was very little around. It was introduced in 1991. There wasn't a lot of resources for teaching history in primary schools, and that's when I got involved, first of all, in advisory work with the government about the sorts of strategies which were needed to support teachers, but then also to think about what materials might be useful. And so that's where the GIN scheme came up, because we developed this history scheme where we were very conscious that we were thinking about producing good stories which would interest children, but we also wanted them to know how they found out. So, I mean, this is a typical one on the ancient Greeks where, you know, we sort of put the pots there so that children could say, well, how did they know how they collected the olives from the trees and things like this? So they were beginning to use sources, pictures as sources of evidence. And we had some really very interesting discussions about illustrations as well. I remember this one, and because I looked it out today. Here we have, this is Vikings, and they're building Offa's Dyke. You probably can't see it. But when this came from the proofs, I said, there are no women building Offa's Dykes. And we sat down and we said, well, would women be building Offa's Dykes? Now, let's just think about how many people there are around at this time. It's a subsistence economy. Maybe women might have been helping to build Offa's Dyke, so we put some women in. But but we don't know. I mean, that's the bit about it, isn't it? We don't know whether women did, but it would seem likely that if there's not many people around, that you'd need to call on them. So fascinating discussions we had. It's amazing to think now how when resources are so readily available on the web, how in the early 90s to actually get pictures for children to look at and things like this was really very difficult. And so I actually made a lot of picture books, just a series of history pictures for children to look at. I mean, this is the fire brigade timeline, so you can have a look at how fire engines change through time. But at that stage, we really needed hard copy. There wasn't a lot of electronic copy. So I did a lot of picture books as well, because I wanted teachers to be able to look with children at historic pictures and say what happened. And we did it even for the very youngest children. This one was done just a little bit later. And what we did with these was, I was worried that when you use artifacts with children, they have no idea of the size. You show them a picture and they don't really know. So we did this story about a day in a life in a Victorian child. And what I made sure that we did was we actually had the artifact on one side for them to look at. You know, these are things which people used in Victorian times. And then on this side, we actually had them showing how they were being used. Because for children, it's no good just having a picture of an object like that. They need to see it in context. So that was another way that we were developing work. And this one became a big book for use in the literacy hour as well. So that was great because it was cross-curricular. But actually, just to show you the problems they have, I've shown this to students and they call them little plant pots. And of course, until you actually see them in a desk, you might think they might be little plant pots for little seeds, or you've put the pen in it. So it's important to show context. Okay. So I want to move on now then. So the national curriculum has been in existence now for nearly 25 years, and only minor changes. But since the Conservative government came in, there's a big change now. Michael Gove has been concerned that children should know again the great tradition of British history. There's been several inspectorate reports which have said that children have an episodic grasp of the past. They don't know when the Middle Ages come and how the Middle Ages relate to the Tudors and where the Stuarts fit in with the Victorians and things like this, because they haven't been taught chronologically. And I'll come back to that in a bit, because they haven't learnt one thing after the next after the next. And so Gove has been talking quite a lot about this and saying that the curriculum needs changing and reforming. And also David Cameron is very keen on history as well. He's used it as a mechanism to gain support from the right wing of his party, and his recent claims is that he's rejoicing that Kings and Queens are now back in the curriculum. And this, Our Island Story, was his favourite book. When he was asked, he wasn't like other politicians. Nick Clegg said it was the Gruffalo. For David Cameron, it was our island story. Yeah. And as you can see, that's why he said it captured my imagination, nurtured my interest in history. Well, this is interesting because the book was stopped being published in 1953. And Cameron must have been at school in the 70s or something like that. So it doesn't say much about his school updating resources for a start, does it? Anyway, it was written for young children in that big island, Australia, for the children to know a little bit more about the little island in the west, England. And its full title is An Island Story, A History of England for Boys and Girls. And, well, it raises some interesting questions about who actually occupies the island, doesn't it, if it's just the English. Closer inspection, though, of the chapter contents do reveal that the stories are about Llewellyn and Owen Glendower, and there is Robert the Bruce and Bonnie Prince Charlie and Flora MacDonald. So maybe other nationalities other than English do live within this island. It's been reprinted, however, now in 2005 by Civitas, which is the Institute for the Study of Civil Society, who actually will send copies free to any primary school who asks for it. Right? And the story is now changed so that it's Our Island Story, A History of Britain for Boys and Girls. And it's unabridged, so as well. Now, this storybook has been particularly useful for David Cameron, who continues to praise this text, most recently in his speech supporting the union with Scotland. Perhaps he finds her comments on the Union of Parliaments particularly supportive, because she says, "Wise men saw that there could be no real union until there was only one Parliament, until English and Scots met and discussed the laws together. It was not an easy thing to do, but at last all difficulties were smoothed away." But it's not just David Cameron who thinks this book is absolutely the bee's knees. I mean, just look at these. It's one of the most influential works of history of the 20th century, from the time's end. Cutting edge, brave mix of truth and myth. I mean, it has an incredible lot of praise for it. Interestingly, Henrietta Marshall saw her book as a storybook, not a history lesson. The facts, she claims, will be found in history lessons. And although there are facts in her stories, the book also includes stories which wise people say are only fairy tales and not history. These stories are important as they are part of our island story and ought not to be forgotten any more than those stories about which there is no doubt. And so for those who are familiar with the work of Eric Hobsbawm, we can see how these stories contribute to a nation's invented traditions. So let's move on and just have a look at these people here. Well, we know Drake played bowls. We know Raleigh put his cloak in front of Queen Elizabeth. You know, Boudicca defended her two daughters against the Romans. And we got Flora MacDonald and Bonnie Prince Charlie there, ready to escape. So all the traditions of Britain. But let's have a look a little bit more. Before the Romans came, Britons had been ignorant and wild. And I love the picture which goes with it because it doesn't match. In many parts of the country, they wear no clothes at all. But it doesn't quite, does it? And of course, in actual fact, a lot of recent scholarship on the Celts says what a very sophisticated society it was. King Alfred, she thinks, is great. He was good, wise, kind, never a better king. I love the fact he didn't fight for love of conquering, as other kings did. Fought only to save his country and his people. Alfred the Great, Alfred the truth teller, England's darling. Well, you're okay if you're Alfred, but Charles II doesn't do very well. He was lazy, selfish and deceitful, a bad man and a bad king. And Richard, although he was a good knight and a brave soldier, he was not a good king either. So they're all dismissed. And then we come to actually having a look at Wilberforce and Equiano. Another chapter describes England's steps towards liberty in the reign of William IV, with the passing of the Great Reform Bill and the abolition of slavery. Marshall explains that in the old rough, wild days, no one cared about the sufferings of these poor black people. Those enslaved are portrayed as passively accepting their position, and there's no indication in the text of the struggles which black people engaged in to gain their freedom. Rather, according to Henrietta Marshall, it was the more kind-hearted and good men, such as Wilberforce and Macaulay, who couldn't bear to see the misery and unhappiness of the slaves, who put the pressure on the government to change the laws. Marshall puts the case for recompensing the plantation owners for their loss of slaves, but makes no mention of recompense for those who were enslaved. One could argue that given the time when Marshall was writing, this account of the slave trade and abolition of slavery was not unusual and generally accepted. But the 2005 Civitas edition, however, doesn't change Marshall's texts at all to take into account any new scholarship about what we know about slavery and the slave trade. It does, however, include different illustrations, amongst them which we've got William Wilberforce here and Ulado Equiano. So the struggle for black people for emancipation is condensed just to this caption. There's no more in the text, it's just that. And I think this is frankly misleading, because given recent research, it's deeply disturbing that children should be reading this in a very modern edition, the Civitas edition. And this would appear to be the challenge. What responsibility do educators have to ensure that young people are introduced to the most recent scholarship and research concerning what happened in the past? And is it appropriate that children are introduced to only one single perspective of the past, as presented by Marshall, given the range of representations which historians now use in interpreting what might have happened? In the 21st century, where children are bombarded with information, we could argue that it's imperative that educators take responsibility to ensure that children engage critically with texts and different sources of information, and to encourage them to explore and to evaluate different points of view. So as you can see, I've got some reservations about Henrietta Marshall's text and question whether it's been a helpful influence on the framing of the history national curriculum, which is due to be implemented in schools in 2014. So I'm going to move on now just to have a look at what is being proposed. And I'll start off, I'll just give you a little look at that for a moment. This is the draft which came out in February 2013. This is just for Key Stage 2, this is for 7 to 11-year-olds. And in the words of one of the history boys in Alan Bennett's history play, it's just one damn thing after another, isn't it? And Simon Sharma, who was actually called in to help do it, he said, I'm sure Michael Gove didn't actually want to give us 1066 and all that without the jokes, but that's pretty much what we've got. It was condemned universally. It was just a list of things which happened in Britain, very little global European history, and it all ended at 1066 as well. So there was a lot of condemnation about it, and the curriculum was rewritten, and this is what is proposed for September 2014. First of all, there's consideration about the ways in which you learn history, so that children are taught about chronology, to have the language of time, what comes before, what becomes after. They learn about Tudors, Stuarts, the Stone Age, the Iron Age, the ancient Sumerians. I'll come on to those in a minute. So they learn about those, and they learn stories about the past as well. They learn about change, and they're able to talk about reasons for change, causation. They look for similarities and differences between now and then. And they're able to start picking out what historical information might be significant for learning about the past. And they know that the range of sources of information are important. So they could be pictures, they could be artifacts, documents, buildings, statues, whatever. And they look at some things in a lot of detail, and they look at some things in much broader outline. The one thing they haven't got there, which was in the earlier curriculums, is they don't actually look at the way the past is represented. They don't look at different interpretations of the past. That's missing there. So that's how you learn history. Now let's look at what we're going to learn. Nice wodge of British history, starting from the Stone Age up to the time of Edward the Confessor. 1066 is still a really important date. We could do some local history. We can do an aspect or theme in British history beyond 1066. So we could look at lives of children in Bristol during the Blitz if we wanted to, so that we were doing a little bit more modern history. Then, to keep, so that we can actually do some comparisons and comparing and contrasting with Stone Age and Iron Age, we go and have a look at some other ancient civilizations, ancient Sumer, the Indus Valley, ancient Egypt, and the Shang dynasty of ancient China, all about the same period as the Stone Age and the Iron Age in Britain. So we can draw contrasts with them. That's our global history. So one asks oneself, how relevant is this type of global history going to be for children in the 21st century? They learn about ancient Greece, and then they look at a non-European society, which enables them to contrast Vikings with early Islamic civilizations, Mayan civilizations, and the Benin. What you've got there is just a load of archaeology, which is great, and children do enjoy it. But it's actually, it's over the top. There isn't very much else to do. It doesn't give them the opportunities to look at other sources of evidence, like some of the evidence which I've got here. It's all the remains of the past which have been dug up. So it is going to limit their experiences. I also think that it's not really going to help these children who are studying history for 4 years to understand a little bit about themselves as people as well. I think it's important to learn some archaeology, but they have also to learn about their place in the world and how things have got to where they are, to understand a little bit more about the world. And it's a bit disappointing that that isn't there. So, what's missing from the history curriculum at the moment, I think, is the notion of a child as an active learner, interested and enthusiastic to learn about the past. The text of the history programmes of study, its purpose of study, aims, attainment, targets and subject content is devoid of words such as enjoyment, enthusiasm, interest in. In the new curriculum, there's only one sentence where we are told that history education should inspire pupils' curiosity to know more about the past. And the emphasis here is on should, i.e. that you can learn curiosity. It can be something which can be imposed. So the question is, maybe there's no place in curriculum documents for consideration of the curriculum on children's emotional, social, general holistic development. In fact, how a study of a particular subject may contribute to their overall development. And such views might be associated with what Michael Gove has named the Blob. The Blob is based on 1958 science fiction film about an amoeba which is eating up the world. In the case of Michael Gove, the Blob is bureaucrats, academics and teachers' unions who are challenging the progress towards a world-class education system. I'm not sure where I fit in the blob, but I'm somewhere there, I think. So I want to move on now to just think, well, how is children's curiosity aroused? What does make them interested in history? And I think, as you said at the beginning, learning about where you live is really important. So I thought I'd tell you a little bit about where I lived as well. And I was brought up in a small Derbyshire village called Eyam. It looks as if it's Eham, but it's Eyam. And it means the place of the water, so Eham. And it was an Anglo-Saxon settlement. Its claim to fame really was in 1665 when a tailor who'd ordered some material from London, where the plague was raging, had it delivered to his cottage here, this plague cottage here. And the clothes were damp, so he put them in front of the fire to dry, and then began to feel a little bit poorly. And within 2 or 3 days, he was dead. He'd caught the plague. And he'd caught the plague which had come from London in the bundle of cloth. The people who he was lodging with, they died very suddenly afterwards. And the plague spread throughout the village. There was about 350 people living in the village, and at the end of the plague, only 260 people had died, so it practically wiped out the village. As the winter went on, in 1665, it got colder and fewer people died of the plague, so they thought it was going to die out. But it didn't. When the spring came and the hot weather came again, it returned and more people died. In fact, August of 1666 was an enormous, lots and lots of people died in the village. And as you go round the village, you can still see lots of sites associated with the plague. In fact, the villagers quarantined themselves. They isolated themselves from the rest of the community. And so they left food for them, the people who lived outside the village. They left this is a Montpesson's well, and they used to put the coins in the water so that it would be sterilised, and food was left around here. This is at the other end of the village. Is this stone which has little holes in it, and they used to put vinegar in the holes again to disinfect the money which was put in there, and food was left. And you can still go around the village and see these places. And there's some really very, very sad stories as well. This is the Riley Graves, which is a farm just outside the village, and there Elizabeth Hancock buried her husband and 6 children within 8 days of the plague. And she never caught the plague. It's absolutely amazing. So why she was immune, I don't know. I have to ask for some thoughts on that sometime. But she never caught the plague. And then the saddest thing, well, one of the other saddest things was that the rector at the time was William Montpesson, and he got the village together and said, we can't leave the village, we can't spread the plague. They shut the church. He sent his 2 children away, but his wife, Catherine, said that she would stay and support him. And in that August of 1666, she died. And this is the plague register, and you can just see here, Catherine, wife of the Rector of Eyam there. And this is her tomb, which is in Eyam churchyard. And from my bedroom window, I used to look over onto this tomb. Every August, we used to put a bowl of red roses on the tomb to sort of celebrate her death, well, to commemorate her death. All the children in the village knew that story, people came obviously because they wanted, visitors came to the visit, but also all the children knew that story. Some of them, their families went back as far back as the plague as well. So they had some connection with that place. And they remembered it as a community as well. So the church was shut, and every year services were held in the Cutlet Delph, which was an open air. And these are two services being held early on in the 20th century. And so it continued, because here we have them walking past the plague cottages in 1928. And here we have sometime, I suppose, around 1960s somewhere, because in here, that little bit there is me as a choir girl, there is my brother, I think, as a choir boy, and there's my father as the priest leading the service as well. So it was a story which was told, and which actually meant something to the people in the village. And that's what I think history should be about. Something which means something to people. So, in terms of local history, it's good to see that there is a local history study unit coming onto the curriculum. And I've worked with children in Bristol looking at different aspects of history. This was some 7-year-olds who were learning about Brunel. And what was really wonderful about that is they caught the train from Filton to Brunel Station, had a look at Brunel Station. They went on the harbour. This is what this is. This is the barge in the harbour, where they went then onwards to have a look at Brunel's SS Great Britain. And from the SS Great Britain you can look up and you can see the Clifton Suspension Bridge as well. So they really got to know about Brunel. But what also was important was that parents were sent off to libraries to look out for more books on Brunel for their children. Grandparents used to come in with newspaper cuttings of Brunel incidents, which they'd read about in the newspaper, to bring in as well. Children wanted to take their parents to the Brunel sites in the city. So in the end, it became a whole family learning. It wasn't just something which you did at school. The whole family were involved in it. And I think that's really very important. It's good to see now that the Department of Education is now funding a 3-year Heritage Schools programme, and this is designed to promote a sense of pride in the locality. I'm very pleased to see Michael here, who's running the local Heritage Schools in Bristol as well, which is actually helping children in Heritage Schools in Bristol to really understand their locality. Of course, children do need to express their own points of view as well, and unlike Henrietta Marshall's, where you get one view of the past, I'm particularly pleased with the children in this school, Year 6 children, who actually were thinking about whether we should remember Edward Colston and actually how we should remember him. And you can see they're really they're aware of sophisticated arguments about the extent to which someone who's been involved in the slave trade should be celebrated and remembered, but whether he should be forgotten as well. They've really thought very carefully about this, and whether this memorial to him is appropriate. Curiosity is also engendered through handling things as well, and I've got here, I just want to introduce this one because I should always remember Martin, and he used to have artefacts which he would ask children to unwrap, and he would record what they were saying there. This feels funny, a bit hard, it's all knobbly, and they got really more and more excited as they tried to work out what was inside and talk about them. So having artefacts in the classroom, you know what they are? boot stretchers. It's a really fascinating way about introducing the past to children. And I've got lots of artefacts here which I've used with children, but I'm keeping an eye on the time, so I'm not going to talk too much more about them. But it's a lovely way of getting them excited about the past. And it also is a way to looking at very serious questions about the past as well. And I've put this slide up because this shoe is used in a lot of teaching when we're talking about the Holocaust. And you look at this shoe, it's so very ordinary. It's a little shoe, perhaps it belonged to a 3-year-old. What's it made of? Is it badly worn? Has it been repaired? Do you think he could tie his laces? We begin to make a story about the child who owned this shoe. Bit by bit then, you move on to asking, well, some of the deeper questions about this shoe. You know, so why has this shoe survived? Why is it here now? Why are we looking at it? So how could they kill a 3-year-old? Why didn't somebody stop him? Why didn't somebody save him? How's this possible in a modern world? So you can use an object to actually go down much more deeply into some of the really difficult and sensitive issues in the past. And these are important questions for children to discuss and to be aware of. And when Don and I were planning the book Humanities in Primary Education here, which we began to think about what was special about being human, do you remember? And we tried to think about, is it our roots, our identity, our history, or is it our knowledge of the place and what places mean to me? Or we looked at RE as well, didn't we? And what's important to me as well. And we tried to think how we'd answer those questions with children and teach them in that way. So I'd like just really to conclude then about my views on teaching history. Some of these issues here are very difficult for teachers, and I've worked on projects where we've helped teachers to talk about sensitive issues in the classroom. Last September, I was working in Cyprus, visiting the Association for Historical Dialogue and Research in Nicosia. And those history educators as well were talking about, well, how can you think of a history which all children is going to mean something to all children and to all the societies within this divided island. And I've put up this map of Nicosia just to remind us of the different stories which are going on there as well. This is a Greek map, so you've got all the Greek names on, Greek street names and things like this. Immediately you go into the Turkish side of Cyprus, no names, nothing. It's as if it doesn't exist. And I think that really brings it home to you, the importance of history, actually of knowing other perspectives of history, other stories, rather than just having the one story which is presented to you. And it means that we, as historians and history educators, we've got an important role to play. I began this lecture suggesting curricula should be viewed as cultural artefacts and looked at the proposed history curriculum in 1923. We saw what values were inherent in the selection made then for the alphabet of dates. And I've tried just in this brief lecture to show you some of the influences on the current history curriculum: politics and policy, changing views of history, and notions of effective pedagogy. And I think now I'd just like to stop and say, well, what historians and educations will make of the 2014 curriculum in another 100 years is going to be interesting. And I wondered whether these might be some of the things that they'll be surprised about. Will commentators be astonished with the preoccupation for learning about the ancient past or nation states? And will they be surprised at children's limited engagement in studying how climatic conditions have affected people's lives on this world? And also, will history pedagogy be totally transformed? I hope you're listening up there, John. Perhaps through virtual reality programs and other electronic means, which I do not know. There are many questions which might be asked. But to return to 2014, we now have very clear directives on what history stories should be told to children. And what remains to be seen is how these directives will be implemented by teachers in primary schools from September 2014. And we haven't got many clear indications at the moment. On the one hand, we have teachers who are worried about accountability and fulfilling their obligations towards the statutory requirements of the curriculum. But they're also the same teachers who, like me many years ago, entered the primary teaching profession because they were enthusiastic for the many exciting, creative learning and teaching opportunities it provides to help children develop as whole human beings. And so working in a department of education, a professor of education's role has to be one which not only critiques policy, curriculum policy and education research, but which also finds ways to enthuse young teachers with both confidence and enthusiasm, so that the stories which they tell their children will arouse their curiosity and interest for life. Thank you.